All right, continuing where we left off, class. So I was going to tell you what new historicism is, because we know what regular historicism is. That's when you use historical and biographical information, um, to provide a critical lens on a time period. Now, new historicism is an approach to literary criticism and literary theory based on the premise that a literary work should be considered a product of the time, place, and circumstances of its composition rather than as an isolated creation. So, that kind of dovetails with historicism there. But new historicists aim simultaneously to understand the work through its historical context and to understand cultural and intellectual history through literature. New historicist scholars begin their analysis of literary texts by attempting to look at other texts, both literary and non-literary, to which a literate public had access at the time of writing. It's kind of viewing it in comparison with the other writing at the time period, and which the author of the text under view might have read. The purpose of this research is to understand the relationship between a text and the political, social, and economic circumstances in which it originated. That whole bit about new historicism that I just read to you, that is a quote from Wikipedia. So I don't want to take any credit for that. I just read it word for word verbatim. All right. Thus, historical criticism draws on knowledge of the time period in which a particular literary work was written. Also embraced in historical criticism is familiarity with the writings that a particular author may have known. Now, it doesn't mean you have to write about that, but that's another avenue that you could pursue. Kind of like when we talked about Aphra Behn, and we said, how does this compare to other pastoral poetry that we read from not that we've read, but that, we may read, if we so choose, from the time period in which Aphra Behn wrote. Because pastoral poetry was like a big deal back then. A lot of authors wrote it. How does hers compare to those? Is it different? Is it the same? If it is different, how is it different and why? That would be like a new historical approach to reading Aphra Behn's poem and understanding it and extracting meaning from it. And we discussed some of that also too when we read Aphra Behn's work. So you can go back and look at those professors' notes and our discussion forums about it, and the lecture too. Okay, so anyway, what was I saying? Where was I? There we go. So, you want to what you can include also in the study of the literature that was from the time period was not only the current literature but older literature that an author may have known. Kind of like when we're talking about authors, like which authors have they read? So are they influenced by those authors? And a lot of times we can tell authors that they've read from titles that may have been in their family's library. Like, we know the kinds of things that might be in like Queen Elizabeth's library, and other, kind of wealthy aristocratic families, of the era, of different eras. All right. So, furthermore, knowledge of the author's culture, social status, education, ethnicity, philosophy, country of origin, and the history and politics through which the author has lived, that all contributes to historical criticism-based interpretations of literary works. While students certainly do not need to know every aspect that informs and shapes an author's particular literary work, students would want to analyze some of these to be able to craft their historical criticism-based interpretation of a particular literary work that we have already read in our class. For instance, students could analyze how the dissenting puritanical movement informed Anne Bradstreet's The Prologue. Of course, to write an effective essay, students would then need to formulate, for example, 3 thesis points, 2, 3, 4 thesis points, however long they think they need to be able to write a 4 to 5 page paper. And those thesis points would support the overall historically analytical topic. Or students could perhaps analyze how the philosophies and politics of the 18th century shape Abigail Adams's request for women's rights in either of the 2 letters to her husband that we read for class. Again, an effective paper would introduce the titles of the works in its introductory paragraph, or the title of the work, in its introductory paragraph, and then conclude that introductory paragraph with the 3 or 2 or 4 point thesis statement, however many you think you need to develop a paper of that length. I mean, I say probably 2 is too few, right, to write a 4 to 5 page paper. 3 or 4 might be about right to be able to make a 4 to 5 page paper. Of course, this is just advice. I leave it up to you to decide what's ultimately feasible for your essay. So anyway, so you would use specific thesis points to develop an argument that maybe philosophy and politics impelled Abigail Adams' request to her husband. And you would analyze, one of those 2 letters to expand upon that. Other potential historical criticism essays could analyze how politics and social pressures affected the rhetorical construction of Elizabeth I's speech to the troops at Tilbury. That was her speech, that she was sending her troops off to go fight, a battle that was in that war with Spain. And of course, the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is what ended that conflict. So those troops ended up not having to, I think, they didn't have to, do a longer war because, they were able to defeat them at sea. So you could analyze, those kind of political interchanges that were going on, the battles against Spain, social pressures, for Elizabeth I. She's a female queen, so she talks about a lot of things that compare herself to a man, but also refers to herself as a woman. So she's kind of straddling that balance between male and female in that time period. Another potential historical criticism essay could analyze how neoclassical literature or literary convention influenced symbol, diction, and subject matter in Phyllis Wheatley's poem to S.M., a young African painter, on seeing his works. So yeah, that could be an interesting analysis there. Of course, that was her, the fellow artist that she had met, Scipio Moorhead, that she was writing the poem about. And he did an engraving of her too that I had in the lecture picture of. This example actually contains the essay's potential 3 thesis points: neoclassicism in Wheatley's poems, symbols, in the Wheatley poems, symbols, neoclassicism in the Wheatley poems, diction, and neoclassicism in the Wheatley poem subject matter. So that's an example of how you could use 3 thesis points to analyze that poem and draw upon historical information for those thesis points. All right, an obvious candidate for historical criticism analysis would be, for instance, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Chapter 30, The Slave Warehouse from Uncle Tom's Cabin, that we read for class. Such a paper could analyze 3 particular atrocities of the American slavery system that Beecher Stowe illustrates in her chapter, The Slave Warehouse. Of course, the 3 thesis points would be each of the 3 atrocities and the way in which the chapter illustrates and comments on them and the historical basis for them. Mary Shelley's story that we read, The Mortal Immortal, also captures many impulses of the day in which she wrote it, that early 19th century time period. For instance, a historical criticism analysis paper of Shelley's story could analyze how the story incorporates the early 19th century's obsession with science, supernaturalism, and classism. The essay's 3 thesis points are again obvious, science, supernaturalism, and classism in the short story, The Mortal Immortal. Another potential historical criticism essay could analyze Jane Austen's epistolary novella, Love and Friendship, alongside an exploration of Austen's surrounding prevailing social conventions. For instance, arranged marriage, the epistle as socially sanctioned female form of writing, and the novel as social instruction. So there, again, you could have 3 thesis points on that. You're not confined to 3. I said you could have more than 3. You could, so work it however it works for you. The list of potential historical criticism essays could go on and on because our course has already discoursed much on how history, culture, philosophy, religion, literary tradition, etc. impact the writings of a particular time period and author. Our anthology, in fact, begins each of its theme sections with a historical picture of each time period. the Middle Ages and Renaissance, 17th and 18th centuries, and 19th century. Furthermore, my weekly lecture notes, discussion questions, and professor notes in direct response to each week's discussion questions amply explore how history, culture, social convention, religion, philosophy, classism, economics, literary tradition, etc. shape literary works from each time period. So go back and look at those, if you're looking for inspiration or looking for examples of how to write a historical-based literary criticism of a work. And it has to be a work that we read, for class, one work that we read for class. Another important aspect of historical criticism is how literary works themselves reveal the aforementioned historical aspects and even comment on and contribute to the impulses of the day. Again, my weekly lecture notes, discussion questions, my videos, and professor notes in direct response to each week's discussion questions amply explore these aspects of historical criticism. So, to brainstorm ideas for this paper assignment, students may want to review carefully the anthology's introduction to each literary time period that we have read thus far, as well as review my weekly lecture notes, my weekly lecture videos, the discussion questions and students' responses there, and my professor's notes in direct response to each week's discussion questions. Students may also choose to extract information from the internet and or library to better inform themselves of the historical impulses of the day for a particular literary work or biographical information on the author. Okay, so remember to focus on a narrow selection of unified elements to discuss one pattern or element of meaning, theme, or significant message within or surrounding the literary work that is bolstered by historical information in some way. Use the elements you find within and outside the story to trace, or the literary work, to trace and demonstrate the pattern of meaning or element of meaning or message that your thesis statement strives to prove about that literary work that you choose to analyze for this midterm essay assignment. You may use any of the weekly discussion questions we have had thus far to help you brainstorm an idea for analysis. In fact, if a discussion question lends itself well to a 3 or 4 point thesis statement, feel free to use it. You may formulate your own paper topic, but remember, you must analyze only one of the aforementioned literary works from a historicist critical perspective. If you like, you may use one of the paper topics as suggested earlier in this paper assignment, or you may use one of the aforementioned paper topics at least to jumpstart your brainstorming ideas on historical criticism, by which you may analyze your chosen literary text, which of course is one that we've already read for class, in those time periods I told you, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, 17th and 18th centuries, and the 19th century. So you choose one from one of those time periods. If you have questions on the appropriateness or focus, or any other issue with your thesis statement or the paper itself, do not hesitate to post on the discussion forum that I've set up for the midterm essay, or even email me too. That's another avenue for clarification. Remember to use a thesis statement that lists the thesis points of historicist criticism that your paper will use to examine meaning in the particular literary work from our course readings that you have chosen to analyze. Standard 3.5 academic essay format, as described later in this assignment, could be conducive to such an essay, but you may structure your essay in any suitable, clear format. Okay? Remember to show, not just tell me your evidence. In other words, concentrate on and provide specifics from the literary text to prove your points of historical textual meaning gleaned from literary elements. Don't just tell me about something, show me, by providing actual quotes that you're analyzing. And don't be afraid to quote from the text itself. In fact, you should quote from the text. But when you do quote from the text, make sure you explain how that quote fits in with your paper's argument to prove one of your points. And don't just give me a patchwork of quotes from your text. Your paper's argument should be mainly in your own words with quotes and paraphrases to provide supplemental evidence and illustration of your points. And remember to explain those quotes and paraphrases and show how they illustrate and prove your points that you're using them to illustrate.